From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
Fat Tuesday becomes Tariff Tuesday. Welcome to the fastest show in politics as President Trump implements tariffs against Canada and Mexico just hours before addressing a joint session of Congress. We've got a big day in Washington, and the retaliation has already begun, as we'll discuss in a moment with Bloomberg White House correspondent Josh Wingrove. Trump tonight will surely say, drill, baby, drill. We'll get into the impact tariffs will have on energy prices and Trump's policy overall with Tom Kloza from OPIS. And we've got our signature panel with us on this day in Washington. Rick Davis and Jeanne, Zaino, Bloomberg Politics contributors, getting us ready for the big speech tonight following the tariffs taking effect this morning. We've, of course, got our eyes on the financial markets with big implications here when it comes to these tariffs. And that's where we start today with Charlie Pellet at World Headquarters in New York. Charlie?
Hi, thank you very much, Joe Matthew. I've got you covered on stocks. The Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ all declining. Wall Street wondering just when President Trump might step in as stocks keep falling. Another down day, and here's where we stand with the S&P now lower by 1.3% to 5771. That is a drop of 78 points. The Dow down 683. For the Dow Industrials down 1.6%. The NASDAQ Composite Index down 0.9%, while the Russell 2000 Index of small cap shares especially hard hit, down now by just about 1.8%. We've got the 10-year yielding 4.15%, with the 2-year right now 3.90%. Gold up $23 the ounce, $29.15, up by about 0.8%. And West Texas Intermediate crude down 0.9% now, $67.77 a barrel. Bitcoin trading lower by 1.9%. Bitcoin at 83,631. Stephanie Roth is chief economist at Wolfe Research. She says no question the U.S. economy is now facing significant headwinds.
The combination of the policy mix probably couldn't get worse at this point. Of course, things could always get worse. Yeah. But if you were to define something that's really quite negative for the economy, this is it. We have government layoffs, the private sector is getting squeezed. We have these massive tariffs, which, by our estimates, that could shave about 1 percentage point off the U.S. economy.
Stephanie Roth of Wolfe Research. And again, the 10-year now at 4.15%, the 2-year 3.90%. Stocks getting hammered across the board as concerns about the impacts of a trade war on the global economy spur a flight to short-term bonds, gold, and haven currencies. Earnings news now. Target and Best Buy are warning consumers to expect higher prices as a direct result of the tariffs that President Trump imposed on Mexico, Canada, and China overnight. Now, speaking on CNBC, Target CEO Brian Cornell said its shoppers will likely see price hikes in its stores over the next couple of days. Today, we do have Target after earnings down now by 5.5%. Best Buy after earnings down by 15%. Balance of Power continues now. Back we go to Washington. Once again, your host, here he is, Joe Matthew.
All right, Charlie, thank you so much, setting us up perfectly here on Tariff Tuesday. Welcome to the fastest show in politics. It's the Tuesday edition of Balance of Power here on Bloomberg Radio, on the satellite radio channel 121, and on YouTube, where you can find us right now. Search Bloomberg Business News Live as we count down to the big speech. 9:10 p.m. Eastern, they tell us. But things have a way of sliding when everybody wants a handshake and a hug coming down the aisle. We will have special coverage of the president's address to Congress starting 8 p.m. Eastern time tonight on Bloomberg TV and radio. On Tariff Tuesday, they took effect earlier today. The president said this, as you heard live on Bloomberg yesterday, 25% tariffs on Canada and Mexico. Here is the president of the United States.
25% on Canada and 25% on Mexico, and that'll start. So they're going to have a tariffs. They can't come in and steal our money and steal our jobs and take our factories and take our businesses and expect not to be punished. And they're being punished by tariffs.
Well, they are as of now. Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum says, give me till Sunday, having said we've got Plan B, C, and D ready. That's when countermeasures, as we reported here at Bloomberg, will be announced. Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau not waiting around. In fact, he spoke a short time ago, as you heard live here on Bloomberg. Let's listen.
There is absolutely no justification or need whatsoever for these tariffs today. Now, the legal pretext your government is using to bring in these tariffs is that Canada is apparently unwilling to help in the fight against illegal fentanyl. Well, that is totally false.
Really interesting to hear the Commerce Secretary, Howard Lutnick, on the other network this morning saying this is not a trade war, this is a drug war. Resetting the trade policy is what comes April 2nd, those reciprocal tariffs we're talking about. If this is all about fentanyl, we know that Canada and Mexico are in two very different places. And that's where we start our conversation with Josh Wingrove, Bloomberg White House correspondent, with us at the table. It must be a big day if you're here in person. Thanks for joining us.
I'm here to serve, Joe.
Well,
what's going on?
For it. So,
you know,
there's nothing they can do in the meantime, apparently, to prove that they've made good on some of these concerns, as Justin Trudeau outlined, the measures that have been taken to stop the flow of fentanyl, the money spent on securing the border. What is it that Donald Trump wants?
I mean, it is the Prime Minister's belief, you heard him say it today, that this has been essentially a ruse, that there was no sincere effort on fentanyl that could have alleviated these. He said he'd been holding out hope that it was, merely a bargaining chip or negotiating tactic. Obviously, that has not been the case, or at least as we sit here now, is not the case. And so, he's moving to essentially sort of trade war footing. And it's, the clip that you played from President Trump, well, is it about factories being stolen or is it about fentanyl? It is tough to say. And then Secretary Lutnick this morning saying this is a drug war, not a trade war. The trade war is just 3 weeks away. So, right. All these things are kind of coming in together. And for those people who are just tuning in to these threats, I think a lot of people have been tuning this out, right? Trump makes a lot of tariff threats, a lot of tariff threats. In the first term, he made a lot of them. The scale is so much bigger now. I think that's really important to understand. This is not just hitting steel and aluminum, and in particular, only certain countries with steel and aluminum. He today has enacted these tariffs, 25% Canada, Mexico mostly, 10% Canadian energy, 20% on China, on the three biggest trading partners, also the three biggest customers of U.S. products. He's picking a fight with the three countries that have the broadest firepower to fire back. This is structural, and there's more stuff coming down the pipe next week.
Yes.
Steel and aluminum tariffs, 25%, potentially rising above that. Following that, April 2nd, both the reciprocal tariffs and the sectoral ones, both of which could pile on to Mexico and Canada, by the way, and fuel these responses that we're already seeing. So we're in it right now.
While we're considering conditions that could be met, the first time I've heard this was in that interview with Lutnick earlier today. We need to see material reduction in autopsied deaths from opioids.
Yeah.
You cover this White House closer than anyone I know. Have you ever heard that line before? Is that the new metric?
The first time we heard that metric was about a week ago.
Okay.
And that felt
what does that mean?
To the Canadians like a goalpost moving scenario.
What's material?
They want to see a reduction in fentanyl deaths in the U.S., which, of course, everyone wants to see.
Autopsy deaths. Why include that term?
I'll leave it to the Secretary to say why he said that. A week ago, what we were told by a White House official is fentanyl deaths in America need to come down before these tariffs go away.
Yeah.
That was what we reported. To the Canadians and Mexicans, that was new to them, because not only have they been saying, well, it's kind of unclear what we've been asked to do, but the public reasons were things like fentanyl at the border, in other words, seizures, border enforcement, that kind of thing, as opposed to domestic fentanyl deaths. I should note, Canada, like many other Western nations, has its own problem with fentanyl deaths that they're trying to, most developed economies are grappling with the scourge of this. So that was, to the eyes of many Canadians, a goalpost shift. To the eyes of the Americans, that is the current metric, saying these tariffs are staying in place until that. So I should note, if you are, for instance, a Canadian steel producer, you might be facing tariffs of 25 on steel, plus 25 allegedly on drugs today, plus the reciprocal tariff, which, by the way, Secretary Lutnick made clear today is still coming down as well, and will count, for instance, the Canadian GST, which is a federal sales tax on all goods, imported or not, as a tariff in responding kind. So you could have three tariffs if you're a Canadian steel producer. You can imagine what that does. For instance, Stelco, recently bought by Cleveland Cliffs, based in Ohio, home state of the Vice President. Wonder what they think about all this.
Well, we've heard from Canada that this could mean an immediate recession in the Canadian economy. But what's going on here? Look at this market. Biggest loss yesterday of the year, the S&P 500 back to where it was before the election, and we're not slowing down. Even crypto is falling. You've seen the reaction on the bond market. Donald Trump seems to pay attention to that. What does he think of this Wall Street reaction?
Many of the president's close supporters that I talk to will say that the market reaction is one of the few things that is a true metric for him, that he believes strongly in it. And so you have to think that he's taking this seriously, but they're also saying, look, there could be some temporary pain. So I think some people in his administration kind of expected an initial reaction, and the question is it more prolonged or deeper? But I do think that President Trump just has been talking about this for a while. On the Canada stuff, he keeps raising Canada. He's not asked about Canada. Joe, I'm Canadian, and in these rooms, no one's asking about Canada. You just keep circling back to it. And so I think that it is clear that Canada is on his mind, and he wants to, pressure the country. And we should also know that in about a week, there'll be a new prime minister, and then potentially a couple months after that, maybe even another new one. So this is coming at a point of, transition in the leadership of the federal government in Canada.
Some have suggested he could help to get Trudeau's party reelected as a political backlash here.
Trudeau's party was on the mat in polling,
not so much
and has
now.
Completely rebounded because of this.
Is that where we're going?
And now it is a much closer election between the Conservative Party, which had looked like it was primed to be sort of like cruising to a strong majority government mandate, and now who's to say?
We've only got about a minute left. Of course, saving all the good stuff for the end here, but this big speech tonight, they're talking about 2 hours. Is that real?
A standard Trump speech is like an hour, so.
Well, that's true. Democrats are talking about bringing noisemakers into the hall tonight. What are we in for?
I'm thinking of getting pizza, so I'll just speak for myself. Okay. Look, he wants to do a few things. He wants to give a victory lap. Obviously, the current market reaction will dampen that. Yeah. He does want to call for things, including additional border funding. We've heard, Tom Homan talk about the need for further resources. So he is coming with a wish list, not just, a celebration of what's being done. But other than that, we're going to hear a lot about the border. We're going to hear a lot about a theme of restoring the American dream, which will dovetail on tariffs. We will hear stuff on Ukraine. We'll be watching closely for a response to what we've heard from President Zelensky about an hour and a half ago, sort of opening the door again to further talks. So there'll be a lot of news in it, I think.
He likes to make announcements.
He likes to make announcements, but
does he want to get in the mix with Democrats? Does he want to get into a little call and response a la Joe Biden?
I guess we'll see.
This could be a night, huh?
Yeah, he doesn't have Pelosi over his shoulder now, so it's a little bit of a different dynamic.
So much body language to watch, and of course, much messaging ahead today. Josh Wingrove, thank you so much, Bloomberg White House correspondent, setting us up for the big speech on this Tariff Tuesday. Our special coverage starts 8 p.m. Eastern Time. Stay with us on the fastest show in politics. I'm Joe Matthew. This is Bloomberg.
It's 12:21 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. We have got the Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ all declining. We're off session lows, but still looking at a 65-point drop in the S&P 500 index, down 1.1%. Dow Industrials down 617 on the Dow, a decline right now of 1.4%, while NASDAQ is down 108, decline there of 0.6%. 10-year at 4.17%, with the 2-year currently yielding 3.91%. Gold up $22 the ounce, up 0.8%, $29.15. And West Texas Intermediate crude down 0.7%, $67.90 on WTI. Bitcoin down 0.9%, off session lows at 84,600 on Bitcoin. Well, certainly the automakers watching any tariff developments closely. Yesterday, Bloomberg News reported the tariffs could potentially raise the cost of cars coming out of Detroit by $12,000 a unit. Bloomberg's Barry Ritholtz has just wrapped up a conversation with Chicago Fed President Austin Goolsbee.
So I've been out in the Fed 7th District, which includes Michigan, and talking to leading auto executives and auto suppliers, and they've highlighted that tariffs, especially on Canada, Mexico, when Canada, Mexico, the U.S. is such an integrated supply chain, they've highlighted that these tariffs on intermediate goods, that is on parts and supplies and components, are going to mean higher production costs, and they're going to translate into higher prices on consumers.
Chicago Fed President Austin Goolsbee speaking with our Barry Ritholtz. Again, Ford down 2.6%, General Motors down 2.5%. Recapping, stocks lower, S&P down now by 1.1%. The tariff, the 10-year on this Tariff Tuesday, 4.17%. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News now, wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Charlie Pellet. That's a Bloomberg Business Flash. Back we go to Washington. Lots going on today. He's looking at a long day. Once again, your host, here he is, Joe Matthew.
Yeah, we're in for the long haul. Charlie Pellet, thank you so much. Speech doesn't start till after 9 o'clock tonight. And boy, we could be sitting here with Rick and Jeanne around midnight on Bloomberg TV and radio. Don't call it the State of the Union because it's his first year. The president will deliver his address to Congress tonight. Having said it will be big, remember, Truth Social, I will tell it like it is, said Donald Trump. And well, we're just going to have to get together around 9 o'clock to find out. That's when it starts. Our special coverage begins at 8 p.m. Eastern Time. The theme tonight, the renewal of the American dream, according to the White House. There's not planning to leave the Capitol until almost make that 11:30 Eastern Time tonight. So we're in for the long haul. I suspect there's going to not only be a lot of handing and backslapping, but maybe some deal making. I'll remind you, the government runs out of money in 10 days. First-term Senator Elissa Slotkin, Democrat, Michigan, in the crosshairs on this Tariff Tuesday, will be delivering the official party response. We'll carry that as well. Does America have a State of the Union, so-called, and an Oscars ceremony in it in the same week? 32 million people tuned in to see Joe Biden's last State of the Union in 2024. It'll be interesting to see what happens here. It's Canada we're watching today, and Mexico, of course, on this Tariff Tuesday, 25% in each direction, north and south. And the retaliation, as I mentioned, has already begun. We heard from Justin Trudeau a little while ago here, and they didn't wait, as I mentioned, implementing retaliatory tariffs of nearly $100 billion of imported U.S. goods, $30 billion effective immediately, another $125 billion in 3 weeks' time. And Justin Trudeau, you know, he has a bit of a light touch, although he was clearly not very happy when he spoke to the press this morning. Doug Ford was smiling. The leader of Ontario, the premier of Ontario, smiling as he suggests cutting off energy for America. Here he is.
A tariff on Canada is a tax on Americans. If they want to try to annihilate Ontario, I will do everything, including cut off their energy, with a smile on my face. So, and I'm encouraging every other province to do the same.
Well, he wasn't actually smiling, but you get the point. Ontario Premier says Starlink deal has been canceled. We'll add another log on the fire here. Raising great questions about what tariffs mean for energy. Of course, Donald Trump tonight is going to say, drill, baby, drill, right? That was the centerpiece of his approach to inflation. Production ramped up. There's been some talk, and we'll get to this with Tom Kloza, about what Russia might be able to do to lower oil prices. But let's get into this conversation right now with the global head of energy analysis at OPIS, an authority on these matters, and always great to have Tom Kloza with us here on Bloomberg. Tom, happy Tariff Tuesday. We're looking at the reaction in the markets here. WTI, West Texas crude, is below $68 a barrel. What are we worried about?
Well, I think that yesterday's news from the OPEC group about increasing production in April has really, I hate to use this verb, trumped the tariff tirade for now, because oil prices moved into the 60s substantially for both Brent and WTI on that news. We're not seeing that much of a reaction right now for Canadian companies and for the U.S. companies that import from Canada. There's one exception, and that's in New England, where Irving Oil, which has a 320,000 barrel a day refinery in the Maritimes, raised prices by 20 to 27 cents overnight. But it's pretty limited. Nothing to observe in the mid-continent. And the discount for Canadian crude, which has been about $12.50 to $13, is about $12.85 right now. So If you didn't know about all of this Sturm und Drang with the tariffs, you would think that crude oil is reacting to other elements, as they should with the OPEC Plus agreement.
And that's something. How much does Donald Trump have to do with that decision, that announcement from OPEC?
I don't know if he has anything to do with it. You know, the year was setting up to be a very, very cheap year for liquid oil. And I think it still sets up that way. You can make the argument that the tariffs and the impact from that, from a trade war, is very deleterious to sort of global GDP. And there's nothing that impacts petroleum demand like global GDP growth. If you take the job cuts and you take the tariffs, you can probably cut into that growth, which most people thought would be somewhere between 750,000 and 1.2 million barrels a day this year.
Mm-hmm. What's going to be the real impact of this tariff program? And I know we're still trying to get our heads around it. Tom Kloza, markets have been moving in a couple of different directions. You heard Doug Ford there. If they want to annihilate Ontario, he says, I'll do everything, including cutting off their energy with a smile on my face. What does it really mean for the industry, though, in prices?
Well, if he were the premier or the governor or whatever of Alberta, it would mean a lot more, because most of the crude oil that we get, the heavy crude, is from Alberta, from Hardisty. And right now that's trading for about what it did beforehand. And you know, probably scraping around $55 a barrel right now. So the tariff ostensibly would add about $5.50 to that. But we're not seeing it manifest itself in downstream markets yet.
Interesting. Now, let's say they stay in place a couple of months because we don't have a great sense of what it would take to bring them down. And we're looking at Canada specifically here, I guess, when it comes to crude oil. Could this create a disruption in that trajectory, that lower price trajectory that you're talking about?
Oh, yeah. It could mean that the people in the mid-continent who typically have the cheapest energy prices, they might have the most expensive. Canada is a stranded seller. In other words, you know, they export 4 million barrels a day or just a little bit under that to the U.S., and they really don't have many other choices. They can move some stuff to tidal water on the Trans Mountain Pipeline, but not a great deal more. The other problem is the U.S. refiners in the center of the country are stranded buyers. It's going to be very, very difficult for them to come up with crude oil they prefer if Canada is not selling it. But I think the sense out there in the oil markets now, in the energy markets, is that the tariffs on Canada are going to be measured in days, not in weeks or months. I could be wrong on that. Mexico's a little bit more complicated because Mexico, it's 25%. And a lot of the Mexican crude goes into foreign trade zones, which is U.S. refinery complexes that ostensibly could run Mexican crude and not have to pay the tariff because they'll be exporting refined products, gasoline and diesel.
Huh. Wow. Fascinating. Before I run out of time here, Tom, I heard a fascinating conversation, speaking of which, earlier today on Bloomberg with Dawn Fitzpatrick. This is the chief investment officer at Soros Fund Management. Considering the impact that Russia could have on this whole picture if we got a peace deal in Ukraine, here's what she said on Bloomberg.
The U.S. really can't drill more. It's not in Saudi Arabia's best interest to produce a lot more. They need about $90 a barrel to balance their budget. So the lever he can really pull there is Russia. And one kind of wild card would be Russia dropping out of OPEC. And that would have a real impact on oil price in the context of moving it lower.
Speaking this morning at the Bloomberg Invest Summit, how does that hit you, Tom Kloza?
I agree that that's a significant tail risk. If there's a rapprochement with Russia, we're going to get Russian molecules of liquids or natural gas, and that could be very, very harmful to sort of the oil price universe at the moment. Now, that's probably a second half 2025 event if it's out there at all. But, you know, there's some banks who retain bullish views and they go, well, Russia will comply with OPEC. What in history has ever suggested that they would comply with restrictions that are placed upon them? So I agree with Dawn. I think she's spot on that.
What would that mean for crude oil in the second half, the price of crude?
I think that with a Russian rapprochement and with, let's say, an end to some of the tariffs for Canada, I think you're talking about crude oil, having some trades at below $60 a barrel. That's for WTI, maybe about $3 or $4 higher for Brent.
Fascinating.
It's hard to be bullish about crude oil right now. Very, very hard. Right. Despite the tariffs.
Well, you're going to hear drill, baby, drill tonight for sure. Tom Kloza, in our remaining moment, what else do you want to hear that might make you feel better about prices this year?
I don't know. We're going to hear about energy dominance, but, ironically, we achieved energy dominance during the Biden administration, despite an adversarial relationship. So I don't think that most companies are going to be interested in bringing more hydrocarbons to the market, with the exception of natural gas that they can export. So I think we'll get a lot of rhetoric and we'll get hyperbole, which is very predictable, but I don't think we'll get much in terms of policy change.
It's always great to have you, Tom. I appreciate it very much. Tom Kloza, Global Head of Energy Analysis at OPIS, with the straight take ahead of the address to Congress later. It starts a little after 9 p.m. West Texas crude, 67.84. We're down about 1% today and apparently heading lower yet if Tom Kloza has the right take on things. We'll assemble our political panel next. The signature panel is with us on this big speech day in Washington. Rick Davis and Jeanne Zaino are on the way in as they put the final touches on the address. It's next, right here on Bloomberg.
It's 12:40 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. The Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ off session lows, but stocks are still getting hammered across the board as concerns about the impacts of a trade war on the global economy spur a flight to short-term bonds, gold, and haven currencies. Right now, the S&P is down 60. That is a drop of 1% at 57.89. Dow Industrial is down 570 now, a decline of 1.3%, while NASDAQ is lower by 81, a drop there of 0.4%. The Russell 2000 index of small cap shares hard hit, down 1.2%, and the 10-year currently yielding 4.16% with a 2-year 3.90%. Gold is up $21 the ounce, up 0.7%, $29.14 on the precious metal. West Texas Intermediate crude, just talking oil, down 0.6%, $67.93, and Bitcoin at 85,180. Bitcoin now down by 0.2%. Traders now see the Fed picking up the pace of rate cuts, and with that story, here's Bloomberg's Vinny Del Giudice.
Money markets are fully pricing in 3/4-point Fed rate cuts this year. The imposition of tariffs on Canada, Mexico, and China marks a turning point for the U.S. economy. It shows White House threats are more than a negotiating tactic. The Fed next meets on interest rates on March 18th and 19th. Fed Chair Jerome Powell is scheduled to deliver a speech on the U.S. economic outlook on Friday. Vinny Del Giudice, Bloomberg Radio.
Automakers lower on the imposition of tariffs on Canada and Mexico. Ford shares down now by 2.5%. General Motors lower by 3%. Again, recapping, equities lower across the board. Tariff Tuesday with the S&P down 1.1%. The 10-year right now 4.16%. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now wherever you get your podcasts. Back we go to Washington. Once again, your host, Joe Matthew.
All right, Charlie Pellet driving our way here on the round trip back to levels we haven't seen since before the election. Not a good look after the losses we saw yesterday on Wall Street. Biggest loss of the year yesterday for the S&P 500. We'll see where we end up today. Even if we're off the lows, the market does not seem to be terribly pleased to wake up on Tariff Tuesday, as they're calling it, with new levies in place, yes, against Canada and Mexico. Retaliation already happening from the north. We haven't even talked about China yet. And yeah, it'll probably come up in President Trump's address to Congress later on, but he's got a lot of other things to talk about as well. Bloomberg, of course, obsessing over tariffs for good reason. Look at this reaction. I mean, it is moving markets. But we're going to be listening very closely for news on Ukraine. And over the course of the program today, we'll be touching on a couple of the elements, as we just did Tom Kloza when it comes to energy. Ukraine we'll get into with our panel here, with the headline coming from the White House here: Donald Trump temporarily suspending military aid to Ukraine, impacting more than $1 billion in arms and ammunition in the pipeline and on order. This is a big deal. And it may have a lot to do with the fact why President Zelensky is talking about Donald Trump's leadership here, strong leadership on the road to peace. Vice President J.D. Vance sat down with Sean Hannity on Fox to talk about the peace process and the ask for security guarantees from the United States, keeping in mind this minerals deal that President Zelensky came to the U.S. to sign last week is still sitting on the table. Here's J.D. Vance.
The very best security guarantee is to give Americans economic upside in the future of Ukraine. That is a way better security guarantee than 20,000 troops from some random country that hasn't fought a war in 30 or 40 years. The security guarantee and also the economic guarantee for Ukraine is to rebuild the country and ensure that America has a long-term interest. You're not going to do that if you come to the Oval Office, insult the president, and refuse to follow his plan for peace.
So what will be the message when it comes to Ukraine? What will get members of the Republican conference in the House, the Republican caucus in the Senate on their feet? It's where we start with our signature panel. They're with us for the long haul today. Rick Davis and Jeanne Zaino as we approach the address to Congress. Bloomberg Politics contributors. Rick is our Republican strategist partner at Stonecourt Capital, and Jeanne, of course, our Democratic analyst and senior democracy fellow with the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress. Rick, what do you expect when it comes to messaging on Ukraine specifically, knowing that Donald Trump wants to make an announcement? Will he say that this minerals deal is as good as done?
Yeah, I think that he'll say, certainly from our perspective, it's done. All we need to do is get Zelensky's signature on the page. And obviously, he's putting Zelensky through his paces to get him to the point where that signature looks like it will have been earned by Trump, kicking him out of the White House, saying that he's not ready for peace, freezing the military aid. All these things are a process that Trump wants Zelensky to have to feel the pain before he can, let him come back into a partnership on these minerals. So I think we're probably going to see that in full display tonight. And this is probably the last moment that Trump will use to put Zelensky in a box before he lets off the pressure. So the good news is this may be the worst day of the year for Zelensky, but then again, it probably gets better from here. And of course, I think that's probably what Zelensky's focused on based on his most recent comments.
Jeanne, we heard from Volodymyr Zelensky. My team and I stand ready to work under President Trump's strong leadership to get a peace that lasts. The first stages could be the release of prisoners and truce in the sky, ban on missiles, long-range drones, bombs on energy and other civilian infrastructure, and a truce in the sea immediately if Russia will do the same. Is that enough for Donald Trump tonight to say that Zelensky is on an airplane and he's coming back to sign this deal?
We can never tell it's Donald Trump, but clearly the ball is now in the Trump administration's court. It was in Vladimir Zelensky's court, and we understand that even Lindsey Graham helped put that statement together and gave it the old thumbs up, better days ahead after it went out. But we do have to see how the Trump administration responds to this. The reality is that we had just a few hours after the dust up is probably the best way to say it in the White House on Friday, we had the administration pause aid to Ukraine. I think they would like nothing more than to make that aid pause permanent. So now is he going to join again with Vladimir Zelensky in this mineral deal and release the aid again? I think we really have to wait and see. And of course, this is not just about the United States and Ukraine. It is also about Russia. That remains a huge question mark looming over all of this.
Well, I wanted to ask you about that because Bloomberg is reporting that Russia has agreed, Rick Davis, to assist President Trump's administration in communicating with Iran, reaching out to Iran on issues that include the nuclear program and its support for some of the proxies we've seen antagonizing and frequently attacking U.S. interests. Is this good news? Is this the kind of thing that Donald Trump will get Republicans on their feet over tonight?
That'll be one of the harder things to get Republicans out of their seat after years of berating Joe Biden's deal with the Iranians on nuclear weapons. To not have any details about what a deal would look like or whether there's even one possible, but to welcome Vladimir Putin as our deal partner in an effort. That's going to be tough to jump out of your seat and applaud. That being said, anything that gets nuclear weapons out of the hands of the Ayatollah is a good thing. And so if Vladimir Putin can help produce that, then I think we have to be cautious, but hopeful that that something like that could actually benefit our negotiating position. So you can't rule it out just because it's Putin. And as they've said out of Moscow lately, Trump and Putin have a lot of alignment on where they see the world going, and maybe this is one way we can take a step back from nuclear annihilation at the hands of the Ayatollah.
Mm-hmm. Well, maybe they'll have some signs made up for this in the House chamber tonight. Jeanne, I don't know what Democrats are going to do with any of this, but what I'm reading is pretty wild. It's not just that they're going to be bringing special guests and made up of federal workers who've been laid off or others impacted by the work of the Doge. Politico says, get ready for the noisemakers. They're going to have props, noisemakers, signs with anti-Trump, anti-Doge messages, eggs. I don't know if we're throwing eggs, but empty egg cartons to get to the price of eggs here. I love pocket constitutions. I'll tell you, nothing will shut them down like that. But really, noisemakers, Jeanne, we're in for quite a ride if that's the case.
We are. Gone are the tame days when, I think it was 2017 or maybe it was 2019 when the women all wore white. Gone are the days when it's just about how you dress or boycotting. If we do indeed see noisemakers, gosh, Joe Matthew, I hope nobody is throwing eggs, but I could see some eggs being raised. I, of course, am in favor of the pocket constitution. Never should travel without one, so that's okay, as long as they hold it up nicely. But this is where we are, and we know the Democratic leadership has been pushing hard against this. They have been urging their members not to become the story, not to take the sort of attention off of Donald Trump and everything that's gone on in the last 43 days. But it's hard for Democrats to do that because on the ground, Democrats are deeply, deeply concerned about what they're seeing in the last 6 to 7 weeks. That includes Doge, that includes Ukraine. I mean, you can just go down the list. So to imagine that all of these members gathered together and nobody takes a stand to draw attention to that, I can't believe it. So, I am just worried about what we're not thinking somebody might do, and that may be what we see.
Boy, I guess Joe Wilson is the OG at this point. Rick, when it comes to disrupting the State of the Union, I guess he was ahead of his time. But I do want to mention a headline that Donald Trump just put up on Truth Social, Rick, and it has to do with the tariffs, because surely he's going to talk about that tonight. He says, please explain to Governor Trudeau of Canada that when he puts on a retaliatory tariff on the U.S., of course, they were announced earlier, our reciprocal tariff will immediately increase by a like amount. I'm bringing this up because you're looking at the reaction today on Wall Street, Rick, and we talked about it last evening on the program. We took a deep dive on the S&P 500. We've now round-tripped in the markets to where we were pre-election here. That's certainly not a look that Donald Trump likes. What does he say about that later?
Yeah, look, I'm sure that he's watching the markets, especially yesterday's cratering of the S&P, and is thinking, this is a bad report card, especially leading up to the big speech tonight. And yet he's not convinced that this has anything to do with his trade policies. When you hear him talk, he thinks trade policies are going to make America rich again, and that should have a beneficial impact on the markets. He hasn't been watching the flight to safety, and maybe those things don't care, that he doesn't care so much about them. But as far as he's concerned, the way to make America rich again is to put up these tariffs, charge foreign countries, we're not charging Americans, and get them to pay our bills and rebalance the trade deficit. And I don't think anything that anybody says, including the performance of the markets is going to dissuade him of this. He's been talking about this for a long time, 20 years. And I think he's now seeing that he can actually, as president, flex this muscle without any Congress or lawsuits. I mean, everything else he's doing, he's either got to hit Congress or he's got to convince the judiciary to let him do it. And this is one where he gets full field running, and he's going to do that. And he's not intimidated by countries like China and Mexico, and he sure as heck isn't going to think that he's got to worry about Governor Trudeau in Canada, even though Trudeau's right. It's going to cost a lot of money for everybody in both Canada and the United States, and nothing really positive is going to come out of it. But look, I don't know. I mean, I imagine that tonight he's going to take a victory lap on the tariffs and say that this is what's making America financially stronger.
I think he's got a terminal. He posted on Truth Social. It's a screen grab of a New York Times story in black and gold. Interesting, Jeanne. There's a senator, a Democrat from Michigan, who's going to deliver the official response tonight. In our remaining moment, I'm giving you even less than that. I'm sorry. How does Senator Slotkin frame this when it comes to the impact on Michigan?
I think she frames it as what she ran on, which is the costs of goods, grocery stores, eggs, as we talked about, but avocados, oranges, tomatoes, everything, prices go up. Maybe she quotes Trudeau, Donald, you're a smart guy, but this is a dumb thing to do. And there's hardly a person outside that administration who disagrees with that.
Is it a win to quote Justin Trudeau tonight? I don't know. Jeanne and Rick will stay with us our second hour with our signature panel. And as I said, they're in for the long haul. Special coverage starts 8 p.m. Eastern time tonight. Kaylee Lyons will be here. Rick and Jeanne, myself, Anne-Marie Hordern will be in Statuary Hall on Capitol Hill with some special guests. You'll want to make sure to join us right here on Bloomberg.
From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
Tariff Tuesday brings quick retaliation. Welcome to the fastest show in politics as Canada responds to 25% tariffs with its own levies just hours before President Trump delivers his address to Congress. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kaylee Lyons in Washington. Welcome to the Tuesday edition, the early edition of Balance of Power. Kaylee, it's interesting. The markets don't seem to like this, but based on the most recent truth from Donald Trump, this could just keep on going.
Yeah, it certainly could. He seems to not like what he heard from Prime Minister Trudeau earlier today, who I would remind everyone said these tariffs were, quote, very dumb. And the president now saying on Truth Social that Governor Trudeau, once again referring to maybe the 51st state he would like to see, should be explained to. He says, please explain to Governor Trudeau of Canada that when he puts a retaliatory tariff on the U.S., our reciprocal tariff will immediately increase by a like amount, knowing reciprocal tariffs are slated for April 2nd. Right. And it begs the question, would that be an additional 25% on top of the 25% that is implemented as of today? How does this math work?
Great questions, and we would love answers. Maybe we'll hear them in the big speech tonight. Yeah. It's slated to start just after 9 p.m. We'll have special coverage here. It's going to be a long day in Washington with a lot of news, and not just on tariffs. We're looking at Ukraine and so many other topics today. The market's not in a great mood while we're having this conversation.
Yeah, so we'll see how the president addresses the moves in the markets and how Americans are feeling about the economy when he addresses a joint session of Congress this evening. And we'll be speaking with one lawmaker who, of course, will be in the room for that. Republican Congressman Mark Alford of Missouri will join us in just a minute. But first, we begin with a check on the markets. Charlie Pellet has a look from New York. Hey, Charlie.
Hi, thank you very much, Kaylee Lyons. We are off session lows, but still a down day, a lot of red across the board here with the Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ all slumping. Stocks getting hammered as concerns about the impact of a trade war on the global economy spur a flight to short-term bonds, gold, gold, and haven currencies. Here's where we stand. S&P right now down 75 at 57.74. That is a drop of 1.3%. We have got the Dow down 658, down 1.5%. The NASDAQ Composite Index down 138, down by about 0.7%. The 10-year at 4.16%, with the 2-year now at 3.89%. Gold up $18 the ounce, up 0.7%, 29.11. And West Texas Intermediate crude down 0.5%, 68.06 on WTI. Bitcoin now unchanged on the day at 85,300. Among the names reporting earnings, Target and Best Buy, they are both warning consumers to expect higher prices as a direct result of the tariffs that President Trump has imposed on Mexico, Canada, and China. Shares of both companies, they are trading lower. Target down 4.2%. Best Buy especially hard hit today, down now by 13.1%. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now wherever you get your podcasts. And back we go to Washington. Balance of Power continues now. Once again, your hosts Joe Matthew and Kaylee Lyons.
All right, Charlie Pellet with a look at the market reaction to Tariff Tuesday. Thank you so much, because indeed that is what today turned out to be. Obviously, Joe, there was much question as to whether or not the President of the United States would carry through on his threat to impose higher tariffs on China, now at 20%, and of course 25% tariffs on Canada and Mexico. But to be fair, when speaking at the White House yesterday, he did say the deadline of midnight is not going to see a deal done before it. This is happening, and indeed it did.
25% on Canada and 25% on Mexico, and that'll start. So they're going to have a tariff. They can't come in and steal our money and steal our jobs and take our factories and take our businesses and expect not to be punished. And they're being punished by tariffs.
No room left, he said, for Canada and Mexico. And so, as Kaylee mentioned, they took effect at midnight. Justin Trudeau, of course, Canada's prime minister, found room for retaliation, announcing his government would implement retaliatory tariffs, nearly $100 billion of imported U.S. goods. He didn't seem too happy when he addressed reporters earlier today. Listen.
There is absolutely no justification or need whatsoever for these tariffs today. Now, the legal pretext your government is using to bring in these tariffs is that Canada is apparently unwilling to help in the fight against illegal fentanyl. Well, that is totally false.
Donald Trump saying, please explain to Governor Trudeau of Canada that when he puts on a retaliatory tariff on the U.S., our reciprocal tariff will immediately increase by a like amount. So this is suddenly getting bigger before our eyes here, and it's where we start our conversation with Sean Donnan, Bloomberg senior writer for economics, has been far ahead in his journalism looking at the impact of tariffs and where they could hit hardest here in the U.S. Sean, it's great to see you. Welcome back, as always, here. I guess we're not here to talk about the best stuff today, but I'm curious your thoughts when you hear this conversation, because it is happening. And what we heard from Howard Lutnick, the Commerce Secretary, this morning is this is a drug war, not a trade war. That doesn't start till April 2nd, but the financial markets don't seem to be waiting.
Well, I think what the financial markets are latching on to today is something that's been building for a few weeks, and that is we've seen nervous consumers out there already about inflation that's hanging around, and a lot of nerves about today that are coming into play about growth in the U.S. economy. I mean, we are going to see, we heard it from Target, we heard it from Best Buy, but we've been hearing it from other companies all along that they think they will see slower growth, slower demand as a result of these tariffs, and that is going to hit the overall U.S. economy. And if what we're looking at now is, and you hear that from the interplay between Justin Trudeau and Donald Trump today, we're looking at a tit-for-tat escalation. This is a broader trade war, and it's a trade war in North America among countries that are supposed to be allies that have benefited from each other for decades now.
Well, what the administration would say, at least we've heard this from the president, and it's been defended by others close to him, is that other countries will be paying these levies, that it's not ultimately to American consumers. And to the extent that these higher prices are actually passed on to consumers, it's a one-time price adjustment. This is not going to be something persistently inflationary. Is that true, though, Sean, if we're now talking about leveling up even existing tariffs at a later date?
No. So, I mean, it's very clear. When U.S. goods, when imported goods land at U.S. ports, the people pay paying the tariffs, literally writing the checks, are importers. Those are U.S. companies, and they tend, and this is what economic studies have shown over and over again, they tend to pass those costs, or a significant portion of those costs, on to consumers. So, tariffs are a tax on imports, and that is a tax that is paid by U.S. companies and consumers, and we're going to see that hit the economy again. I mean, Howard Lutnick last week was talking about raising up to $700 billion in taxes, in tariff revenue, just from these reciprocal tariffs that haven't been introduced yet. These tariffs, the 25% tariffs on Canadian and Mexican imports and the 20% tariffs on Chinese goods, are going to raise hundreds of billions of dollars more. Those are all going to be costs that are borne by U.S. businesses and consumers, and that's going to hit the economy. The other thing that hits the economy is just the higher cost of doing business from tariffs. If I'm a manufacturer in America today, I rely on a lot of imported components and so on. Those components today cost more than they did yesterday.
Just lastly, before we talk to Congressman Mark Alford about this, we're talking about Canada because we've heard about their retaliation. Sunday is when we'll hear from Mexico. Claudia Sheinbaum says her retaliation will be spelled out. She said she had a plan B, a C, and a D. What are we in for from Mexico?
Look, I mean, one of the things that is really in play and is going to be hit hard here is the auto sector, right? We import cars from Mexico. We import auto parts from Mexico. We also export auto parts to Mexico that go into a lot of those cars that come back in. If those are then hit by tariffs on the Mexican side, it's just going to raise the costs even more than these U.S. tariffs are. And, we'll see how it escalates. If we move from plan A to B to C to D as things escalate, the damage is just only going to grow.
All right, Sean Donnan, Bloomberg senior writer for economics, here with us as we digest all of this tariff news. Thank you so much. Joining us here on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. And joining us now on the program live from Capitol Hill is Republican Congressman Mark Alford of Missouri, who sits on the Small Business Committee. Congressman, welcome back to Bloomberg. It's good to have you, sir. When you consider what small businesses may be thinking today in the face of news of these tariffs, wondering what will happen to the costs they are facing and their ability to pass those costs on to the people who purchase goods and services from them, what would you tell them?
Interesting you should bring up small business. We just had a meeting with a new administrator, Senator Kelly Loeffler, who is intent on getting small business representatives into the rural parts of America. In particular, we requested that in our district just south of Kansas City. And I'll tell you what our small business owners are saying. Look, we know that there are going to be some price increases that they're going to have to pass on to consumers, but it is worth it if we can save 100,000 lives a year through the fentanyl poisoning. This past administration, the Biden administration, with the porous borders, we're allowing this fentanyl poison to come up and this toxins to poison and kill our young people. And so, look, we get stuff delivered to our house just about every day, it seems like, from Amazon. And typically cheap goods, immediate gratification from China. I'm willing to pay a little bit more if we can stop the poisoning, particularly of our young people, that's coming through Canada and Mexico.
Well, that's really interesting, Congressman. We appreciate that firsthand account. If small business owners are telling you that, then they are prepared for some short-term pain, as Donald Trump had previously warned.
Look, I think small businesses got kind of the short-sheeted with this past administration. They have not gotten the capital and counseling that they need from the Small Business Administration. It seems like Administrator Guzman was more concerned about registering Democrat voters than actually getting out with representatives and helping small businesses grow. Kelly Loeffler is changing that, and we are going to make sure that small businesses thrive. Part of that is going to be building small businesses in the rural area. We're intent on doing that. I know that these tariffs might be a temporary setback, but it is a short-term pain for a long-term gain for America. Reciprocal tariffs are what I think that we need to right the ship in America, to gain the respect on the world stage, and Donald Trump is going to do that with my support and the Republican conference.
Well, I do wonder how long-term is the term we're actually talking about here, Congressman, because the president was elected to a 4-year term off the back of concerns voters had about the economy. And if you look at polls that we've consistently seen in the last several weeks, they are concerned he's not doing enough to address the prices they are facing now, let alone what they might face in the future once you account for the impact of tariffs. What does he need to say about that tonight when he addresses you and your colleagues?
I think he's going to talk about his wins already, opening up oil production in America, shutting down the border, essentially securing our border with more than 90% reduction in illegal crossings into our great nation. That puts such a strain on the fabric of America. And I think that some of the other wins that he has is going to go a long way to bringing down the interest rates in America, restoring. If we can get this Tax Cuts and Jobs Act passed through the House Reconciliation and the Senate Reconciliation Bill, that will go a long way to restoring confidence in the bond market, and in turn, I believe the Federal Reserve will bring down the interest rates. I am the chair of the Real Estate Caucus. We just had a meeting, heard from young people here on Capitol Hill who want to buy a home and they can't because of supply shortages, because of over-regulation, Inflation Reduction Act regulations, climate regulations that are driving some home builders out of business. They can't keep up with these regulations. It's adding 25% to the cost of a home in Kansas City. I firmly believe that the economic policies that Donald J. Trump is instilling now is going to turn our economy around in a short order within the next 2 quarters and get our economy juiced again to where we're not going to have to worry about these reciprocal tariffs.
So if the cost of goods, though, continues to rise across the board, and we're looking at now the potential for a trade war, in the words of Howard Lutnick, to begin on April 2nd, how does that help to get more young people in affordable homes?
Well, we raise salaries. I think you're going to see that coming. The demand for intellect, the demand for good labor is there. And so our workforce, if we provide the education they need and the training they need for skilled labor, I'm big on that in our district, they're going to have good paying jobs and they're going to be able to afford not the hyperinflation that Joe Biden brought about, but I think a reasonable rate of inflation that we can all live with a higher salary, higher earning power, and higher confidence in the American economy.
I do wonder about a potential wage price spiral that could stem from that, Congressman, if people are constantly having to demand more from their employers so that they can afford the cost of goods, and that buying power only continues to drive the cost of goods higher. But when we're considering people who have jobs or maybe negotiating their wages, of course, there are now thousands of federal workers who no longer do, given the efforts of the Department of Government Efficiency. I know you had a town hall last week and you had to answer some questions about those layoffs and the spending cuts. Is this making your job and your communication with your constituents harder, if not the concept of reducing the federal government, but the way in which this has been done?
I love talking to our constituents, Democrats, Republicans, independent, politically agnostic. I represent 772,047 individuals. We give the same level of concierge service in our 3 offices in our district. But look, you've got to have a conversation. I want to have a give and take with the constituents. We had a lot of people show up at this. It was really supposed to be a coffee. Usually I have 10 people show up. There was almost 200. I had everyone write down their question on index cards. I read the question, and then when I started answering, they would try to shout me down. That is not an exchange of ideas. That is not answering questions. I want to listen to people, but I also want to have a discussion. And that's not happening now because of organized disruptors who are trying to make what we do ineffective. And that is not right for our constituents who really want to have discussions.
There's talk about organized disruptors on the other side of your aisle tonight. Congressmen, Democrats may be bringing props, signs, even noisemakers, according to some reports. What will be the decorum in the hall later?
Well, decorum is a very big part of the Republican conference. We will maintain decorum. I have no control over what the
Republicans were doing a lot of yelling last year at Joe Biden.
Well, there were some, but I think the vast majority of the Republican conference, including myself, were treating the office of the presidency with respect. And I would encourage all members, Republicans or Democrats, to do the same. Because listen, this is a chance for the chief executive to come in, although technically this is not a State of the Union address. It's a chance to hear what's on the president's heart, soul, and mind. And then for us as Congress, a body, to work together where we can to bring about positive change for America. I think the president, again, whether it's Joe Biden or whether it's Donald J. Trump, President Obama, President Clinton, George W. Bush, or Ronald Reagan, if you're standing up there as a chief executive, you deserve to be heard, and we deserve to give our respect to that office.
In our final moment together, Congressman, as you talk about working together where you can, is one of those areas going to be keeping the government funded beyond 10 days from now? How will a shutdown be averted?
Well, I certainly hope so. I was with the chairman of the Appropriations Committee, Tom Cole, yesterday. I'm now in the Appropriations Committee, and we were talking about that he has tried in earnest to work with his counterparts in the House and in the Senate to keep the government open by passing the 2025. Yes, we're still trying to pass the 2025 budget. We're a year behind. And they reached a top line number, but they wanted to hobble the president and Elon Musk and Doge from doing their job of weeding out waste, abuse, and fraud in the government and finding these savings, reasonable savings for America. And we're just not willing to do that. Tom Cole, the appropriations chair, is not willing to do that. He did not walk away from negotiating. That is something that the Democrats put out there to try to win people over. I'm thinking now, and I think Senator Schumer put out a statement on social media today that they might be going for a shutdown. And if they do, that is a Schumer shutdown. We, under the direction of our leadership, I think are going to move towards a continuing resolution that will fund the government to the end of September. Let's finish out September.
Keeping in mind, Republicans do control both houses. It's great to have you back. Mark Alford, Republican from Missouri. As we look ahead to the speech tonight, we'll assemble our panel next, right here on Bloomberg.
It's 1:21 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. Trump tariffs take effect. Stocks are getting hammered across the board, right to the numbers. We're off session lows, but still a 54-point drop in the S&P 500 index to 57.96, down by about 0.9%. The Dow now lower by 520, down 1.2%. Nasdaq down 43. That is a drop of 0.2%. The 10-year 4.18%, with the 2-year 3.92%. Spot gold up $20 the ounce, up 0.7%. The precious metal now at $29.12 the ounce. West Texas Intermediate crude down 0.1%. WTI 68.25 a barrel. Brent 71.06, and Bitcoin up now by 0.4%. 85,617 on Bitcoin. Honeywell International is paying $2.16 billion in cash to purchase Sundyne. That is a maker of pumps and compressors owned by the private equity firm Warburg Pincus. Honeywell shares lower today by 1.4%. Recapping, stocks lower with the S&P 500 index now down by 1%, the 10-year 4.18%. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash. Balance of Power continues right now. Back we go to Washington. Once again, your hosts, Joe Matthew and Kaylee Lyons.
All right, Charlie Pellet, thank you very much. Checking on the S&P 500 at levels that we haven't seen since November 5th, 2024. And I seem to believe, Joe, that something pretty important was happening on that day. That was, in fact, Election Day.
Yes, indeed.
When, of course, Donald Trump was overwhelmingly, by Electoral College standards and the popular vote, elected president of the United States. And in doing so, helped precipitate what had been a pretty remarkable market rally, with the S&P 500 as recently as a few weeks ago at record highs, something he touted when speaking at the Saudi Investment Forum, FII, in Florida just earlier this month. And now here we are back at levels from before we knew that it was Donald Trump who would be the next president of the United States. And I can't imagine that is sitting extraordinarily well with him as he gets prepared to address the nation in a joint session of Congress this evening at the Capitol.
Yeah, that prompted a big old rally, as we saw following the election. To think that we have done a round trip like this and so quickly, so precipitously, is certainly freaking out a lot of investors. As we watch the markets here, it's kind of turned into a split screen once again. If you remember Donald Trump, toward the end of his first term, every day he'd be out speaking about, remember, it was COVID, and there'd typically be an update on COVID, on vaccines and so forth, and there'd be a split screen on every cable news screen with the financial markets. And we may be back in a world like that as indeed the president addresses Congress later. And it's where we start our conversation with our signature panel. They're in for the long haul today. Rick and Jeanne with us right now. Rick Davis, partner at Stonecourt Capital, Republican strategist, and Jeanne Zaino, our Democratic analyst and senior democracy fellow with the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress. What's your thought on that, Jeanne, knowing that Donald Trump thinks that the stock market is really the ultimate metric when it comes to his success? And the split screen, even if implied, as he addresses Congress and the American people tonight, means what?
Yeah, I mean, rationally, you would think he looks at these numbers and sees all that red and says, gosh, I didn't mean about those tariffs. Let's go back and pull back on that. Because the stunning thing about this is the gains that were made, as you guys were just talking about, have all been lost. And this is a self-inflicted wound. This was not a natural disaster. It is not some kind of calamity that has befallen like so many presidents have dealt with. He has done this to himself and to the economy so far. You know, there is an old statement, civilizations decline when you forget what's obvious. And what's obvious that we know is tariffs are really, really bad for a good economy. Nobody outside of the administration, and probably a lot of people in the administration, disagrees with that. And so why he is doing this, and if he keeps it up, given these numbers, I just can't imagine that he will. But so far, he is all in.
Well, Rick, we often hear said and say it ourselves at Bloomberg that the stock market is not the economy, that fundamentally they are very different things. And yet it does seem what the stock market is reflecting, at least right now, is concern about the economy. So I do wonder what your take is on how Donald Trump is going to speak about this evening, not just thinking of like where asset prices actually are, but what it is signaling about what his policies may do to what everyday Americans are experiencing when they go to the grocery store or to take a look at their bills.
Yeah, I think he's going to double down on this notion that he can reverse the current course of a general economic slowdown and ramp it up. He's got a little bit of success to talk about around oil prices, gas pumps, but you know, he's not going to let facts get in the way of a good story, right? So, you know, he's going to talk about how already the country is moving forward in a better economic direction, and there are, you know, some successes. Inflation's been held down, and so on those things that is positive, he'll take full credit for that. And for all those negative things, I think they'll be in the basket of Joe Biden problems that he inherited. And I think Joe Biden will show up quite a bit in the speech. He's been sort of going back to his campaign rhetoric recently, and using Joe Biden as the person that caused all this havoc in the United States. And I wouldn't be surprised that all these things that are negative related to the economy are going to be Biden problems that he inherited.
Does he speak, Rick, maybe to the temporary pain that he referred to at one point, the way Mark Alford just did a moment ago, that this is about something bigger than the stock market or making money, that he's trying to save American lives by stopping fentanyl at the border?
Yeah, there's no question fentanyl will be the reason that these punitive tariffs have been put on Mexico, China, and Canada. I mean, honestly, I mean, you know, the broad brush on this is awful hard to swallow. I mean, Canada is not the reason millions of people or hundreds of thousands of people have been dying from fentanyl, and yet they get tarred with the same brush as people who have been in part of the poorest problem, and that's Mexico and China. So I did see, though, that the China retaliatory tariffs that went into effect kind of mimic that. You know, they're blaming bark beetles for banning our lumber and soybean fungi for, you know, the reason that they're going to raise tariffs on soybeans. I mean, they're not saying these are retaliatory tariffs. They're saying, oh, we've got defective products. And so this whole tariff war, you know, is turning into the sort of level of sublime idiocy. I mean, like, we're going to start blaming things on beetles and fungi and not really addressing the current problem. So I don't think Donald Trump is going to shy away from both the economic argument. These countries have been living off of our trade surpluses and, you know, living off of our trade deficit. And in the meantime, they've also been hurting our country. So he's going to unload both barrels tonight. I have no doubt about that.
Well, and to Rick's point on Canada, as we're hearing this administration frame it not as a trade war, but as a drug war, according to Customs and Border Patrol data, the amount of fentanyl that crossed the Canadian border last year was just 43 pounds compared to the 21,000 pounds that crossed over the southern border. So we should just bear those facts in mind as we consider not just only the justification for these tariffs that the president is using, but also the way in which it will inform what moves forward. Because, Jeanne, if these tariffs are ever to be taken lower, presumably it would be because he sees some progress. Have we yet seen defined what kind of progress he is looking for? What is going to be enough for him to say, all right, now you've done what I asked. Here go the tariffs. I'm taking them down.
So far, we have not seen that. And if they're going to continue, as Howard Lutnick said, that this is, and we're talking about fentanyl, this is a drug war, not a trade war. How much lower could Canada go in terms of fentanyl? They are just 1% of the fentanyl intercepted at the U.S. border. You don't get much better than that. I mean, certainly we'd all like it to be zero, but that is not the problem. But they're saying that's the problem. So how does Canada repair that? There's no way to go. And this gives lie to what they have been talking about. You know, Donald Trump seems to be responding to a huge real challenge, and that is the loss of manufacturing, many decades in the making. But he is not going to be able to repair that with a trade war against our closest allies without real pain. And I think in your great conversation with the congressman, we just heard how difficult it is going to be for members of Congress to defend that to their constituencies. I mean, we even heard Ron Johnson, a fairly conservative, very conservative guy, say his state is going to feel pain as it pertains to agriculture and manufacturing as a result of this trade war. There is a no-win here, and Donald Trump is not the kind of politician who's going to stand up and say, we're going to take short-term pain for long-term gain. I don't see him doing that, and he can try to blame Biden. I'm sure Rick is right, he will. But the reality is this is a self-inflicted Donald Trump wound, and it's a wound to him politically, and it's a wound to the economy and the market that he's going to have to turn around. I think he'll be able to do that, but he's got to look at what's happening and see the lie of what he has been believing so long, that you can correct the manufacturing decline in the U.S. by a trade war.
Rick, is all this going to make people want to watch? 32 million tuned in to see Joe Biden's last State of the Union in 2024. And you know that other than the stock market, I guess TV ratings are the closest thing to a metric of success for Donald Trump. How much show business do we have to consider here?
Well, he always gets the eyeballs, whether it was, you know, in the days of Apprentice or in his own political career. So I have no doubt we could be breaking records tonight. Plus, the onslaught of his policies in the last 5 weeks is, unprecedented in Washington for a new administration. So I am pretty confident, based on just my own poll of talking to people I know, wondering, like, what's next? They're going to want to tune in and see what news he makes tonight, because it could impact you wherever you are.
Well, will as many people stick around for the Democratic response? Jeanne, it's going to be delivered by the new Democratic Senator Alyssa Slotkin of Michigan, was able to win her Senate seat in a state that Donald Trump carried in November. What is her message going to be?
I think her message is going to be about kitchen table issues. She proved she could win a state like Michigan that Donald Trump also won. She's got to show Democrats a path forward, which is appealing to people who split their ticket in 2024, because she focused like a laser beam on issues that they really care about, which are kitchen issues. But of course, Kayleigh, she does not want to be in a kitchen. We saw that last year around. It's not going to go well. So I suspect she'll have another background for the speech tonight.
Yeah, perhaps not going to take a play out of Katie Britt's book. Jeanne, Sheehan, Zaino, and Rick Davis, our signature political panel, with us on the early edition. They'll be with us on the late edition of Balance of Power, and of course, for our special coverage of this address. It begins at 8 p.m. Eastern time right here on Bloomberg TV and radio. And who knows how long it will go for. The White House is saying that the president will be at the Capitol for more than 2 hours.
Yeah, 11:20, he could still be shaking hands and backslapping, and that's just the way these things go. Questions, too, about whether he might have a couple of meetings or more deliberate conversations with 10 days left till a funding deadline in the government. Interesting, you mentioned Senator Slotkin, the Premier of Ontario, Doug Ford, who had some pretty tough words for Donald Trump today, says he will add a 25% tax on electricity that goes to states, including Michigan.
Yeah, and he'll do so with a smile, right?
He said that, a smile on his face. He wasn't smiling when he said it, though.
Yeah. All right. We'll have more on the tariffs coming up in just a moment with someone who used to serve at the USTR in the last administration. That's just ahead on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
On Tariff Tuesday, thanks for being with us on the fastest show in politics. We're live in Washington, where President Trump will be addressing a joint session of Congress a bit after 9 p.m. Eastern time. We'll have special coverage starting at 8, and hope you'll be with us. Our signature panel will be as well. Rick Davis and Jeanne Zaino, as we consider the implementation of tariffs, Kaylee, on Canada and Mexico. We've already heard about retaliation from Canada, and Donald Trump says we'll just keep on reciprocating. It's an interesting moment, though, as the Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick frames this as a drug war, suggesting that the trade war doesn't begin until April 2nd.
Well, and April 2nd is when we're expecting a laundry list of other tariffs to take effect. The reciprocal tariffs that President Trump was alluding to could impact Canada on top of what already has been imposed today. Auto tariffs are set to go into effect. He suggested Europe tariffs of 25% may be implemented in April as well. By all accounts, at least at this stage, the president is signaling things only go up from here in terms of the way in which the United States taxes imports. But what we are dealing with right now, and what the market is contending with, is the S&P 500 has now erased all gains it made in the aftermath of President Trump's election in November, is the reality that our three biggest trading partners now have tariffs of at least 20% on pretty much every good that comes for them, barring Canadian energy, which of course is at 10%.
S&P 500 now back below 5,800 today, Kaylee. Yesterday was the biggest loss of the year for the S&P. The VIX is rising, and the market wants to know what's next. Maybe we'll learn tonight.
Well, yes. I'm imagining we're going to get a lot more of this from the president's speech. And as we look ahead to that and consider the impact of this policy, we turn to Greta Peisch. She is partner at Wiley, Rein, and former general counsel for the Office of the United States Trade Representative. She's been dealing with trade issues for many, many years. Greta, thanks for joining us here on Balance of Power. When we consider this notion of things getting ratcheted up further, reciprocal tariffs going into place in just a few weeks, is it your expectation that countries in advance of that may actually lower their tariff rates so that they don't face as high a levy from the United States? Or is this just going to raise the cost of everything?
Thank you for having me. I think we don't know. I wouldn't expect countries to preemptively lower their tariffs. I think because of some uncertainty as to what exactly those reciprocal tariffs will look like, what they will count, and how they'll be implemented. And so if countries were to lower their tariffs today before those actions were taken, it would really be negotiating against themselves and trying to predict something that's just unpredictable right now. They don't know exactly what will come out of the Trump administration and those reciprocal tariff actions that they've discussed.
Well, it'll be interesting to hear how Donald Trump frames this tonight. We've heard a lot about temporary pain, that this will be the cost of saving lives. Greta, when the flow of fentanyl is stopped at our northern and southern borders, how temporary would that pain be before the rest of Donald Trump's policies, presuming that things are all passed and codified on Capitol Hill, are put into effect?
Well, we don't know, in part because we don't know what the asks are on the fentanyl and immigration side. We haven't seen a lot of news come out about the negotiations with Canada and Mexico and what specifically the Trump administration is asking in order to resolve these crises and make a dent on the fentanyl and immigration issues. And then, of course, there is the question of what comes next with respect to reciprocal tariffs and other actions that have either started or have been discussed. And so I think the name of the game for these trading partners and for businesses across the border is uncertainty about what the future holds.
Yeah. Well, just to follow up on that quickly, we heard from the Commerce Secretary, Howard Lutnick, this morning. He said that we need to see material reduction in autopsy deaths from opioids. That is apparently the metric. Based on your experience working with the USTR, how is that made clear, and how can our partners reach a goal like that?
Well, my experience at the U.S. Trade Representative Office, doesn't really shed light onto this, because this is really breaking new ground for this administration. They're using new authorities with a new rationale in the trade space, sort of crossing over between what we normally think of as law enforcement issues, public health issues, and tying them to trade tools. And in this case, it's a question how, what's tied directly to our trade relationships with Canada and Mexico, and what may not be. And so, that, again, it just raises a question of how, as you put it, how do you measure? What's the outcome? How do you know that this is successful in addressing these issues? And what are the actions that they're really looking for here?
Well, I'm glad, Greta, that you raise the authorities with which the president is taking this action. We've heard both Canada, through Justin Trudeau, the prime minister, as well as China, suggest that they will be challenging these measures at the World Trade Organization. Could this be overturned through that mechanism? How binding would any WTO findings be? Is there a question around whether President Trump actually has the ability to continue enforcing this?
So yes, I saw the statements around WTO action. At this stage, bringing claims at the World Trade Organization, in some respects, it's symbolic. What the World Trade Organization does through dispute settlement is give trading partners the sort of green light to retaliate for trade actions. Canada is already moving forward with its retaliation. Mexico's doing so as well. So you can see that they're not waiting for those outcomes. They may still go ahead at the WTO to make the point that, in their view, these are inconsistent. The Trump administration may have arguments that there's exceptions that allow them to take this type of action, and we'll have to see how that plays out.
As we spend time with Greta, I want to remind our viewers and listeners we have an important conversation on the way from Bloomberg Invest with Gary Cohn, Vice Chair of IBM. We're only a couple of minutes away from that. I'd be curious to hear his take on this, Greta. And I want to tap your experience on Capitol Hill, because you were also Senior International Trade Counsel for the U.S. Senate Committee on Finance. And among the legislation that you helped to craft and implement was the Miscellaneous Tariff Bill Act of 2018. Now, you must be smirking a little bit, knowing that the aim of that legislation was to reduce or eliminate tariffs on imported goods. Will lawmakers have any role in this? Will there be any legislation surrounding the implementation of these tariffs, or is this all Donald Trump all the time?
Well, I think the current assessment with this Congress is that it's unlikely they'll be doing anything legislatively to alter the course. It is very difficult to pass trade legislation. They would need to do so on a bipartisan basis, overcoming a potential veto from the president. I think that said, members of Congress will hear rising and continuing concerns from constituents, businesses, exporters, importers, potentially consumers, as these tariffs go into place and as they increase. And that political pressure will start to influence members and, by extension, the White House, potentially.
Well, the White House doesn't seem too influenced by any particular political pressure at this time, as it is standing by its policies here. Also keeping in mind, Greta, that they see this as a means to raise revenue. With the tariff levels on this quantity of imports that we're dealing with now, $1.5 trillion worth from our three largest trading partners, with the potential for reciprocal tariffs, with the Commerce Secretary suggesting that could be another several $100 billion raised. How does this mathematically work when looking at what it's going to do to the coffers of the United States Treasury?
Well, certainly it will increase the tariff revenue. you have to, when you're estimating out the revenue collection from tariffs, you have to take into account the fact that imports will likely go down. So it's not going to be 25% on the current level of trade continuing forever, because presumably the current level of imports will go down as those imports become more expensive. And I think that that's part of the objectives that the administration is looking for. So it will be a revenue raiser. I think it's a question of, do the tariffs stay in place in their current form? Is the administration able to maintain that politically? And will the trade stay at this level, or will it decrease in a way that really diminishes the amount of tariff collection that results?
I know it's all about Canada today, Greta, but I am interested that no one's talking about China very much. Donald Trump said he didn't expect Beijing to retaliate too much, were his words, but we've got quite the retaliation, up to 15% on a bunch of farm products here, including soybeans, meat, and grains. Are food prices going up?
Well, we'll see. It's interesting because China did take strong retaliation, but of course, compared to what the tariffs have been put in place so far, I mean, we've put in place tariffs now just in this most recent action on over $400 billion worth of imports. And China is retaliating with targeted tariffs on key agricultural product in the tens of billions, right? But with real impact on those sectors. That will cause pain in certain congressional districts in certain parts of the country. And it will be another cost of this policy.